Most Pokemon that were genuinely good tend to be good for at least a couple of generations before power creep really does its thing. Alternatively, a Pokemon that was good early on might get some major buffs later and wind up being effective in multiple generations, even if they weren't consecutive. Given how most useful traits tend to be at least somewhat cross-generational, true one-and-dones are rare, but they do happen, and we've compiled the top 10 here. The Pokemon that were legitimately capital G good once and only once. We're jumping right into the first generation with Gen 1 Lapras. Lapras was an early generation fan favorite and a solid Pokemon in the inaugural generation of competitive play. It wielded one of Gen 1's most definitive weapons, Stab Blizzard, and had the bonus of Thunderbolt in its moveset to threaten common ice resist in Starmie, Cloyster, Slowbro, and opposing Lapras. In addition to its powerful stab threatening freezes, it could also threaten to shut something down more directly with the inaccurate yet potentially game-breaking Sing. Alternatively, it could cause some real problems by dishing out paralysis with Body Slam and then throwing Confuse Ray into the mix, letting it potentially break through would-be checks like Alakazam. This, on top of its excellent physical bulk, letting it take on the metagame's defining normal attackers Snorlax and Tauros, who didn't much appreciate taking Blizzard in return, made Lapras an effective part of the metagame. However, this was a one-off affair. Lapras being OU viable was more emblematic of Gen 1's quirks than any sort of longer-lasting effectiveness, as it wouldn't be able to find anything near such viability in any subsequent generation. In Gen 1, it had base 95 special, comprising both special attack and special defense, but in Gen 2 onwards, the special stat split into the two that we've known ever since, and its special attack became a notably weaker base 85. Contributing to its significantly lower damage output was also the fact that Blizzard went from 90 to 70% accuracy, but unlike Thunder, it only had 8 PP, so it absolutely was not worth it. Even without the buffs though, Lapras just didn't fit in. In addition to not hitting too hard, not that it had been a real slugger before, it didn't offer any sort of specific utility outside of generally good bulk, though the low speed and the increasing vulnerabilities of the famously flawed half ice typing, making it easy to hit super effectively, this too was limited. Its status spread was both not as game-breaking and done by much better Pokemon now. The closest viable sets Lapras could try to pull off were some sort of whirlpool trap into Parasong antics that anyone halfway experienced knew not to fall for. In Gen 5, it had Dragon Dance and the Hydration ability, but it wasn't at all well equipped for such strategies. Funnily enough, even in Gen 1, Lapras eventually fell to UU, once Body Slam was discovered to no longer be able to paralyze normal types, making it less effective into Chansey, while struggling to compete with Starmie and Cloyster. Though it was still a perfectly worthwhile OU Pokemon, being able to fend off Tauros so nicely was always valuable. Speaking of which, our next selection is Tauros in Gen 1. But before we go into the next one-hit wondermon, here's a word from our sponsor, the GOAT, Surfshark VPN. A VPN, or a virtual private network, is a server that you can connect to that encrypts not only your private data, but also your location. You can even use this to pretend like you're in another country. Now, why would this come in handy? Well, with streaming services like Netflix, you're often region locked. For example, if I were to vacation in Japan, where there are no subtitles on my anime, I could use Surfshark and change my VPN back to the US or vice versa, and now I have American Netflix wherever I go. You can do this with multiple countries because Surfshark has over 4,500 plus servers in over 140 countries. You supercharge any streaming service you have by doing this. And of course, being a VPN, Surfshark keeps your outgoing data encrypted and safe. For example, I travel a decent amount, which means I'm often at the airport and need to use the Wi-Fi to keep track of my spending, because sometimes I go overboard on overpriced meals. But people on the public Wi-Fi at the airport could be lurking to access some of my sensitive data. But thanks to Surfshark, I just boot it up and my data is safe and secure. And one of the best features that separates Surfshark from the other VPNs is that you can use it on unlimited devices. That's right, no additional subscriptions required. You can put it on all of your devices. And there's no risk thanks to their 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you want a sick VPN and also support the channel to help us produce more content, you can click the link in the description below and go to surfshark.com/fallswipe or use code fallswipe at checkout to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN. Of course, the king of Gen 1 had to be on this list, having dominated the initial generation as much as it failed to do anything nearly comparable in any other generation. Well, for a while, the Choice Bander had some solid OU merit in Gen 3, but this didn't last. It was fast and had Intimidate, true, but it was vulnerable to Sand and Spikes, and relying on normal stab had many issues, to say nothing of the fact that the base 100 attack wasn't actually that strong if you didn't have something else going for you, like a stab that hits things super effectively, which Tauros didn't. Sure, Tauros Tauros would eventually get some cool stuff to work with, like Gen 5's Sheer Force and Gen 9's Paldean forms and their signature move Raging Bull. However, Tauros most approximated Jake LaMotta in its peerless inaugural generation, being both dominant and obligatory in a way arguably not matched even by Gen 2 Snorlax, which for all its own dominance, didn't see entire games decided by mirror matches nearly as much as Tauros, with the Tauros War being perhaps the most iconic 50-50 mirror matchup in Pokemon history. Answering it with anything else was nearly impossible, as it perfectly embodied nearly every one of Gen 1's most impactful idiosyncrasies. Its tremendous speed rate translating to a crit rate of over 21%, with that same speed stat meaning you usually had to take 2 hits from it switching in, as not only were there few Pokemon faster, but those Pokemon generally didn't want to switch into it. Not just for the damage, but from the paralysis of its ruinous stab Body Slam, whose unstoppable normal damage was another Gen 1 specificity. You didn't need to hit anything super effectively when the resists were so few and so easily threatened by Tauros' coverage, to say nothing of all the crits and paras it was dishing out, and the fact that you didn't need to withstand multiple Body Slams. You had to withstand Body Slam and its follow-up stab Hyper Beam, which was almost 100 BP stronger and had that Gen 1 only advantage of not requiring recharging if it struck the opponent for a KO, as it often would. Then Gen 2 came around and changed all of that. Crit rates were now fixed at a much lower 6.25%, where they'd remain until being nerfed to 4.167% in Gen 7. Hyper Beam now recharged even if you KO'd the opponent with it. Normal being easier to resist with steals wouldn't have been as bad had it not been for those other two, as Tauros does have coverage against them, but without the crit rate and Hyper Beam to work with, well, Tauros was really put out to pasture. If only Raging Bull had been modeled after Gen 1 Hyper Beam. Funnily enough, in Gen 2, Tauros did gain a counterpart actually, the cow to its bull, Gen 2 Miltank. Miltank is most famous for destroying every challenger to Whitney's Goldenrod gym, but also renowned for its talents in Gen 2 OU, countering none other than King Snorlax. It etched its name in history not just for this, but for how it did this. It is by far competitive Pokemon's most successful user of Growl. That's right, the useless in-game move was wielded by Miltank to answer most variants of one of the most powerful Pokemon ever allowed in OU. Any attempt by Lax to curse up would be stifled by Growl, whose astonishing 40 PP, along with reliable healing in his signature Milk Drink, allowed Miltank to reliably stall Lax out in general. The only Lax that could reliably break through Miltank was either that Belly Drum set, which was rare, or one that would sacrifice itself with self-destruct. Miltank was also an excellent enabler of Drumlax on its own team, able to immediately wake it up after a rest with its Heal Bell, a rarely found move which was generally superb for healing Miltank and its other teammates of status. Growl also found utility in stifling the tier's other cursors, not named Machamp, being able to completely shut down sweep attempts from Steelix, Skarmory, and Heracross, and Growl also slowed down Machamp trying to switch in. As a bonus, Miltank was a perfect counter to the otherwise dangerous mixed attacker Nidoking. Miltank only really fit on bulky teams, mostly stall, but it was thoroughly unique and very good at its role. Sadly, post-Gen 2 power creep ensured Miltank's OU status was a one-time deal. In addition to its resist-lacking normal typing not being supported by sufficient bulk to withstand such powerful neutral moves, the increase in passive damage, such as permanent sandstorm and multi-layered spikes, made it much more difficult to switch in and do anything back at all. It would no longer be growling its way to success. So Gen 2's ultra slow pace meant it was ideal for such strategies, not so much in Gen 3 and beyond. Whitney wept as Miltank was relegated to a career, and an uneventful one at that, in the lower tiers. Now moving on to Gen 3 with Claydol. The passive damage that ruled the advanced metagame found its most complete answer in Claydol. Here was a Pokemon among only 3 others, Flygon, Skarmory, and Aerodactyl, that was immune to both Sandstorm and Spikes. Most Pokemon were vulnerable to at least one, and in many cases both, making the duo the metagame's most powerful, popular defining strategy. Claydol was unique in that it not only was immune to these two, but it also threatened to remove Spikes with its Rapid Spin, and it had a Stab Psychic, which would to comfortably threaten the metagame's go-to spin blocker Gengar. Oh, and the good stuff keeps on coming. In addition to its Sand and Spikes immunity, its Rock Resist allowed Claydol to withstand the stab Rock Slides of Tyranitar and Aerodactyl, the tier's most immediately dangerous attacks, especially with how they synergize so well with Sand and Spikes, threatening most of their answers. Claydol shut down nearly the whole operation, especially with how its Spikes immunity meant it was also immune to the Earthquake that threatened most Rock Resists for at least neutral, if not super effective damage, and even had a useful immunity to Dugtrill's Arena Trap as well. In a similar vein, Claydol's Electric immunity made it excellent against Zapdos and its Thunderbolt, another top-tier Spikes abuser, especially since Claydol had the special bulk to withstand super effective Hidden Power Grass or Ice. Claydol's own Stab Earthquake let it threaten many major targets in Metagross, Jirachi, and the aforementioned Tyranitar, wielding a useful Psychic Resist against Rachi. Finally, though Claydol didn't do a ton of damage most of the time, it did have incredibly useful Explosion to let it check a whole range of Pokemon, from Salamence to Snorlax to Suicune. It was absolutely loaded with incredible tools against pretty much every part of the Gen 3 metagame. Afterwards, it dropped off a cliff. Its bulk had been just right for advance, but couldn't keep up with Diamond and Pearl and beyond. Neutral attacks were now monstrosities like Draco Meteor that were regularly powered up further by new items like Life Orb, and it was easier than ever to hit super effectively, with new additions like U-Turn and a newly physical Crunch and Pursuit in the wake of the physical special split. No more Tyranitar countering here. It was still resilient in the face of hazards, but it was so overwhelmed even this alongside Rapid Spin couldn't find use, especially since it was so weak in return, a problem greatly exacerbated by Gen 5's Explosion nerf. Claydol was perfect for its time, and not at all after that, much like another Gen 3 Exploder and our first legendary with Gen 3 Regice. Another put upon Ice type and successor to Lapras's legacy with incredible parallels. Regice, of course, most obviously suffered once Stealth Rock came into play, but almost certainly wouldn't have been able to reprise its debut generation's OU niche even without it, considering it had all the same flaws that made it fall out of OU in that same debut generation. Still, Regice maintained its solid OU niche, remaining effective and uniquely so, even if its usage and viability wasn't what it once was. It was a similar, Lapras-like tale of low speed, lack of recovery, and not actually being that strong. Updated for the times with its crushing vulnerability to both sand and spikes, but what Regice did, it did very well. It took special hits like a champ and dished them back out quite nicely as well. It wasn't shattering the metagame, but Stab Ice Beam is known to be an effective tool and was bolstered nicely by Thunderbolt's coverage. Where this path diverges from Regice's Plesiosaur predecessor though, was that Regice could compensate for its lack of speed with Thunder Wave, which it spread effectively since ground types feared its Ice Beam, and even more impactfully, its Explosion allowed it to lure in and dispatch opposing special tanks like Blissey and Snorlax for the benefit of its special attacking teammates. Regice was a highly effective offensive-defensive utility Pokemon for special offense teams. Then Gen 4 came, and yes, Stealth Rock was the standout problem, but again, Regice had no speed and no healing in a metagame that was getting faster and stronger. You had to pick one or the other to stand a chance, but as tanky as Regice was, it also wasn't Blissey tier untouchable to compensate for the lack of resist that were now required in this brave new world for every attack being so much stronger. It wasn't enough to just be neutral to moves anymore, though of course it was also easier than ever to spam fighting and fire offense. Regice was relegated to an unimpressive series of barely could call them niches in the lower tiers. Now let's move on to another legendary with Gen 4 Deoxys Normal, and also our first Pokemon that was introduced in one generation yet had its time in another. Deoxys Normal, or just Deoxys, was completely outclassed since for some reason, rather than make base Deoxys the neutral form with a balanced stat spread, it is instead a pallid imitation of Deoxys Attack, or DOA. Deoxys was incredibly strong, with Rayquaza tier base 150 offenses, and utterly astonishing base 150 speed, but Deoxys Attack was equally fast while having base 180 offenses equivalent to the Mega Rayquaza that was yet to exist. The supposed boon for Deoxys was that DOA was one of the frailest Pokemon in the game, the epitome of a glass cannon, with meager base 50 HP matched by utterly pathetic base 20 defenses. Deoxys, on the other hand, had less pathetic base 50 defenses, but make no mistake, they were still pathetic. The difference in practice was utterly negligible, not nearly enough to compensate for the gargantuan gulf between their offenses, in all but Gen 4. Mind you, Deoxys Attack was still an outstanding Pokemon in Gen 4 and remained superior in almost all counts, but Gen 4 was the one place where Deoxys worked that higher bulk into a real genuine niche and was actually good, for its advantageous matchup against the ultimate enemy, another Deoxys form. Deoxys Speed, or DOS, was one of Gen 4 Ubers' most important Pokemon because it was the lead metagame. It was basically a bunch of Pokemon against DOS, the former trying and often failing to stop the latter from immediately laying down Stealth Rock and Spikes, which was a brutal advantage to have in such a high-powered tier. Anti-DOS tactics often involved a combination of a powerful initial attack followed by priority. For example, Rayquaza's Draco Meteor and Extreme Speed to limit DOS to one layer of hazards. Deoxys Attack was quite good in this role, using Shadow Ball or Signal Beam alongside E-Speed. However, it had a major problem. If running Extreme Speed, it was the long-time standard. Deoxys Speed could take Deoxys Attack out first, as the latter was so frail as to be 2-hit killed by such a weak non-stab attack. Here's where Deoxys Normal came in. With some defense EVs, its higher natural bulk could actually get it to avoid the 2-hit KO from Deoxyspeed's extreme speed, allowing it to safely pull off the 2-hit KO. Seeing as DOS is that big a deal, where anything that beats it can be considered to the point of several worse Pokemon being used for such a role, DON's niche was legitimate. What if it didn't face a DOS? Well, in that case, it would just throw down Stealth Rock and maybe Spikes as well, the same as one of the other forms would. This was a specific but genuinely valuable role, but only one that could exist in Gen 4, as it was completely invalidated by Gen 5's introduction of Team Preview. You'd rather just use your own DOS or DOA, if either, and adapt to the opponent's DOS by selecting a different lead. Still, it was great that Deoxys Normal was genuinely good once. Now for another Pokemon whose time to shine came after the fact with Gen 5 Toxicroak. Toxicroak had a similar cross-generation effect, where it was introduced in Gen 4 but really came into its own in Gen 5 with the introduction of Permanent Rain. Its dry skin ability had been useful for its water immunity in Gen 4 UU, but now it allowed it to burst fully fledged onto the OU scene. The water immunity was far more valuable now in a world of specs and rain boosted hydro pumps, but beyond that, Toxicroak also healed the equivalent of 2 leftovers turns in one, or Black Sludge in this case, which had often combined, like Rain Dish Tentacruel, to get back a stunning 18.75% per turn. Unlike Tentacruel though, it also made outstanding use of Life Orb. Magic Guard and Sheer Force Life Orb users may ignore the item's recoil, but even if they don't do what Toxicroak does, which is heal for using Life Orb, well, it doesn't literally of course, but Dry Skin outheals the recoil damage, meaning that Toxicroak can run Life Orb and still heal 2.5% per turn under rain. Additionally, every Tentacruel was envious of Croaks' water immunity, not just against Specs pumps, but against Scald as well. Being immune to both Scald and Toxic was not just superb for a physical attacker, but for taking on other rain teams, which Toxicroak often single-handedly obliterated. It was generally threatening with a variety of movesets, even against sand teams, since Tyranitar didn't exactly want to switch in against it to change the weather. Swords Dance was its go-to, with Sucker Punch finishing off faster would-be revenge killers, but it was also quite dangerous with several substitute variants, utilizing tactics like Toxic and Focus Punch. Toxicroak was also uniquely effective for resisting both of Keldeo's stabs while not being at all afraid of Pursuit Tyranitar that it was so commonly paired with. Of course, Toxicroak being so completely and utterly reliant on Permanent Rain meant once that went away, it would as well. And that's exactly what happened in Generation 6. Rain teams continued to be used, but Toxicroak no longer had any place on them, being unable to function with Drizzle's newly limited window. Its utilization of Rain was more prolonged, just like Tentacruel. Still, Toxicroak at least made the most of its generation's defining feature, much like our next Pokemon with Gen 6 Bisharp. Bisharp was also introduced before its time, in its debut Gen 5, but it didn't do much of anything. Its positive traits underwhelmed by struggling to fit all the coverage it wanted, in addition to lacking consistent Dark Stab, well, besides Sucker Punch. However, when Gen 6 came around, it perfectly embodied several of the most significant mechanics to almost Gen 1 Tauros-like extents. Suddenly, Bisharp had reliable Dark Stab and no longer had coverage issues, thanks to Knockoff's enormous buff, not just in terms of becoming a powerful attack, but also as a beneficiary of Dark no longer being nerfed by Steel. In addition to Knockoff and Sucker Punch's coverage, improving against key targets, Bisharp's secondary Steel stab Iron Head was also much more important now, as it was super effective against the newly introduced Fairy type, which was valuable on its own and for how it complemented its Dark Stab, which Fairy resisted. Finally, Defog was buffed to clear hazards on both sides of the field, but also had its old effect of dropping Evasion, which meant if used when Bisharp was on the field, it would activate its Defiant ability and give it a +2 attack boost. As a result, Bisharp could switch in to punish an opponent trying to clear their field of hazards to effectively receive a free Swords Dance, and thus paired with hazards to put opponents in a lose-lose situation. It immediately established itself as a major threat in XY and was consistently ferocious throughout the generation, being incredibly difficult to safely answer, especially with the hinders posed by Knockoff's item removal. Then Generation 7 nerfed its mighty Sucker Punch, taking it from the 80 base power that threatened to rip through even its go-to check Keldeo once it taken damage, to 70 base power that, while certainly not shoddy, was a significant enough downgrade for a Pokemon whose answers generally hovered the threshold of being able to take its hits or not. Suddenly the task was a lot more feasible. Of course, it wasn't the only factor. General power creep made it more difficult for Bisharp to safely switch in, set up, and fire off its attacks, as did all the new Fairy types that outsped and withstood its Sucker Punch. Tapu Lele's priority blocking Psychic Terrain even shut it down entirely. Bisharp would eventually get its revenge with its debatably over-the-top evolution King Gambit, but as for Bisharp itself, it only really had that one go-around on the big stage, though that turn it took was excellent. Now for a more offbeat Pokemon, we have Alolan Muck in Gen 7. Alolan Muck was not an OU star in its debut Generation 7, but while it did make its home in UU, it had a niche in the standard metagame, and what's more, it had a legitimate niche in Ubers. It had superb defensive typing that made it immune to Psychic without being weak to its common coverage options, Fairy, and Fighting, which allowed it to take on threats as major as Mega Alakazam, Tapu Lele, Deoxys Attack, Lunala, and Mega Mewtwo Y. In addition to switching into such monsters, Alolan Muk was also a massive pain to switch into, and not because it dealt out a ton of damage, but because of its incredibly irritating Poison Touch ability, giving it a whopping 30% chance to poison anything that it used a contact move against. This meant its stab knockoff also had a Scald Burn equivalent rate of dishing out poison, as if the item removal wasn't enough to deal with. It also meant its secondary stab Poison Jab, which came into its own 30% poison rate, functionally had a higher chance to poison the opponent than Ho-Oh's Sacred Fire. It even had Poison Touch priority in the form of Shadow Sneak. Its greatest weapon though was Pursuit. The move's primary function, of course, was to remove the aforementioned monsters it switched into, as well as others like Mega Latias and Mega Gengar. But what it really did beautifully was have a Pursuit that actually poisoned the opponent. This was especially notable against Tapu Lele, which was dark neutral, and thus would survive a Pursuit on switch out, but could be applied against almost any opponent imaginable. Choice Specs Ash Greninja locks into Dark Pulse and has to switch but resist Pursuit. Tapu Koko and Bulu want to run away from the super effective Poison Jab, quad effective in Bulu's case, but both resist Pursuit and have bulk investment. Doesn't matter. At the very least, Muk will chip them a bit. At most, it afflicts them with poison, which makes them much easier to deal with. It could pull this trick off against Arceus Fairy of all things. Those are the resists too, against other Pokemon like Superior and Tornadus Therian, that it becomes much easier. It was an incredible strategy for being uniquely able to force a poison on opponents in a thoroughly unique way. An incredible punish for every time Muk came in against a target vulnerable to the status. Sadly, after Gen 7, Pursuit was removed from the game, and while Alolan Muk would have struggled with power creep anyway, it did lose its specific niche for Poison Touch Pursuits, which is enormous considering how powerful the Ghost type has become, and has relegated it solely to the lower tiers. It's still a decent Pokemon as its Poison Touch still has wide reach, but losing Pursuit was devastating for it in almost Tyranitar-like fashion. Now for the last Pokemon, we're turning up the heat with Gen 8 Rotom Heat. As cool as the electric fire type is, its sole representative, Rotom Heat, didn't find any use in OU for generations, not counting Gen 4, where Rotom Heat, like all the Rotom forms, was still Electric Ghost. There it was great, finding many uses over Overheat's useful, powerful coverage, but once it became half fire in Gen 5, it dropped out of standard play, relegated to jokes about how it theoretically countered Genesect in Gen 5, yet never any practical use at all. Until Gen 8 came around, dexited a majority of the game and provided two major buffs. 1. Heavy Duty Boots, nullifying its long-standing Stealth Rock weakness. 2. Nasty Plot. Suddenly Rotom Heat was a major threat, utilizing its effortless natural bulk to boost up and dish out some majorly powerful hits. Nasty Plot and Overheat actually went quite well together, since a boosted Overheat was obviously the greatest danger, but Rotom was plenty powerful with neutral special attack too, so it hardly ceased to be a threat after. Quite the opposite. Heat eclipsed the long dominant Wash form as OU's defining Rotom, becoming one of the best, most common Pokemon in the early Gen 8 metagame. It excelled at breaking through the bulky teams the meta settled into, especially because after Nasty Plot, Overheat, and the paralysis spreading Discharge as Electric Stab, it still had a move slot open, which it used for Pain Split to let it stick around longer and threaten with Nasty Plot repeatedly. But remember how Lapras eventually fell out of Gen 1 OU? That was after decades of play. Rotom Heat being genuinely good didn't last anywhere near that. Once Gen 8 had fully expanded with the Isle of Armor and Crown Tundra DLCs, Rotom Wash became the superior Rotom form in OU, and it was actually tiered in UU, where Heat returned, just not with anywhere near the same kind of viability in standard play. Yes, its new buffs were still great, but they weren't enough against the stronger, faster, bulkier metagame, what with Heatran, Garchomp, specially defensive Landers Therian around the corner, among others. At least Rotom brought the heat to OU once, but this once stung more than the others, passed over as it became before the generation had even ended. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Don Creek, Eric Dissing, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Gameslayer, Nurse Jake, One Penguin to Rule, Pretzel SP, Seagulls Incorporated, Sojiro Sakura, Spavoon, Gylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Tyler, Kiboflu, Wardine, Zathor for their major support of our videos.